We are fortunate to have attracted today three people who are truly talented in the space. Stephen's chatting with the New York Stem Cell Foundation, and also a successful entrepreneur in San Diego, commutes back and forth between New York and San Diego. And he knows the space. Jeffrey Kraws is going to lead the discussion here. He's with Crystal Research. Crystal is one of our sponsors, and more importantly, Jeffrey is one of the most successful stock pickers we know. Last year's picks from the last session last year were dramatically, so we have him on record for that, so it's not just us saying that, we actually kept track of it. And then Jason Colbert is a leading analyst in the Maxim Group, and has been really following the stem cell space for a long time. So I'll let you guys take it over and tell us what we should be thinking about as investors and how they're running and
Well, I'm pleased you all could join us today, and I'm honored to be with two industry veterans, one of which I've been running a short period of time, but it's well established in the industry. Stephen and I spent about the last 2.5 decades regenerative medicine is very fascinating. I really think it's going to be at the forefront of what the next blockbusters are going to foretell in the industry. I am a bone marrow cancer survivor from the 70s. I actually had the first 50 bone marrow transplants ever done, and am a marvel of modern medicine, and a huge believer in stem cells to be able to be here even talking to you, from the 70s that much later, 40 years later. Regenerative medicine is of particular interest. I'm going to have my two colleagues talk about the individual companies that they like and the areas they like and why. I'm just going to give you a broad overview. Regenerative medicine is of particular interest because of the fact that the overall industry theme is we haven't cured a major disease, in the last 80 years. We had vaccines, we actually haven't cured a major disease. We have treatments, but we actually haven't cured a major disease. There's a common theme that's taking place if you take a look at what's happening to your television, and you pull up and look at Suzanne Summers or Thigh Master who had 15 years ago. You take a look at all the new PD, 90X workouts. You take a look at all of the different fat fighting, cholesterol fighting, new exercise regimens that are all the rage. And the common theme is very simple. The people with the money, which are the baby boom generation, the people with the money want to live longer. They not only want to live longer, but they want to live a more fruitful life so that they can live more comfortably. Well, how are you going to do this? You can continue to combat, as the pharmaceutical industry does, going after recombinant chemistry. You can use biology. You can use all different aspects of it. But the reality is that one of the key tools that you're going to have is the human body. The human body is the most magnificent machine that's ever been created. From the first day you breathe, it does nothing else to the end of your lifetime other than to try and stay alive. And your body, obviously, from releasing adrenaline, pumping up your blood pressure, if you get cut, to being able to release different chemicals to help you either get sleep or respond to flight or fight, is truly a remarkable machine. So what would be important to that remarkable machine? And the thing that would be important to that machine is to, as it gets older, Suzanne Summers once again being proof of this, if you take a look at how she looks in her 60s, having done her own estrogen replacement therapy, is that you want to improve the body's ability to care for itself. And I believe that regenerative medicine, with all of the aspects that it entails, is going to be that frontier that's going to enable the human body to actually care for itself. And in addition to preventative medicine, with people treating so that they don't get sick in the first place, I think is going to provide a very significant part in reducing overall healthcare costs and affording one a better quality of life.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's amazing that you picked Suzanne Summers. How did you do that? Because Robin Smith of Neostem, who I worked for a year, hired Suzanne Summers to be kind of the spokesperson to attract liquidity to the stock. So, we can talk of all the directions that I could possibly, open with and talk about regenerative medicine to kind of start talking about Suzanne Summers. But it brings up a really good point, and that is, how do you tell what's real and what's not? There's so much misinformation about stem cells, about what they are, about what the companies are, about what their business models are, and about how these companies have been able to sustain themselves over the last 10 years. Because one of the things that's really clear is the industry probably came public a decade too early. And so we've had lots of promises and then lots of disappointments. And so a lot of people have kind of abandoned the industry. industry, and I totally understand that. I could talk with you about paradigm shifts. I could talk with you about monoclonal antibodies. I could talk with you about the pharmacet example. But those examples don't fit cell therapy exactly, and that's because those examples went preclinical, phase 1, phase 2 in a relatively short period of time. We've been hearing about stem cells really for about 20 years, and there have been multiple disappointments, and we hadn't seen clinical trials. In fact, for the most part, we haven't seen any pivotal trials in the space. But I will tell you, this morning I was lucky enough to be a moderator on a panel with 4 companies. Neostem was one of them, Juventus was one of them, Allocure was one of them. And a very, very exciting group of companies. What they all had in common is they're all driving well-powered phase 2 clinical trials that will yield data sometime over the next 6 to 9 months. And because these phase 2 clinical trials are running at about 200 to 300 patients per trial, we're going to get p-values, or we're going to get a really good indicator whether they work in their respective indications. And I think the underlying theme in biotech doesn't change, whether it's cell therapy, whether it's small molecules, whether it's monoclonal antibodies, it's data and clinical data, and the discount associated with preclinical phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And I think if you apply those metrics, what you see is the carnage and disappointment because these companies did come public 10 years too early has created a valuation gap, because now we're seeing that the companies are emerging or about to emerge with proof of concept data that they do have a definitive therapy. And then the last point I'd make before I turn it over to Steve is, what does the data tell us? You're a survivor, bone marrow transplant. I mean, clearly, you would be alive today, probably, if it wasn't for that BMT. So there are mountains of data that suggest cell therapy works. There are lots of interesting things that have happened over the years, but I don't think anybody would deny that there's activity. What the industry has lacked is proper capitalization and the ability to run properly designed clinical trials, and I think that's changing. And I could point to some concrete examples that maybe we can get into.
And there are a number of examples of companies doing regenerative medicine right now. If you take a look, there was over $900 million done last year just in cell transplants. So the industry is there. But one of the areas that's, I think, has the largest promise and has the best prospects, what is the most misunderstood from embryonic to human to you name it, is the area of stem cells. And thankfully, Stephen Chang is with us, who is an expert on the area.
So I'll talk to you about the technology, and I don't disagree with any of the statements here. I come from a hybrid model. I got to look for technology that's so early. So I'm like a pioneer in this thing called gene therapy. And then gene therapy became like a reality. I actually ran into one of the pioneers. He goes, "Isn't it great now that 25 years later, it's actually a business?" And I said, "Yeah, we're about 20 years ahead of our time." And I sometimes think that stem cells, my interest in stem cells actually started in 1983. I published a Nature paper showing that I could transplant a modified hematopoietic stem cell with a viral vector. And that viral vector corrected this genetic defect. And I thought, this was great. I corrected a disease in a mouse and went on to prove to myself over my 25 years that mouse models are probably not the right thing. As a matter of fact, I started a company purely on mouse models. It was a P53 company, and Schering actually, thank goodness, bought me and saved my life. But I could cure mice of cancer really, really well. And the challenge, I guess, at the time was to figure out how to cure cancer, of course, in humans at the end of the day. When I saw in and so I also come from a background of I'm a human geneticist. In that background, I was associated with one of the leading groups in the country, the Baylor Group. Tom Caskey was a visionary about sequencing the genome. And Tom used to say to me, what are we going to do with all this information? And that always bothered me. What I could do with genetic information once sequenced, it was all sequenced. And when Venter and the NIH presented the sequence, it was just a bunch of A's, C's, G's, and T's, just mountains and mountains of data. And I worried, I said, I kept concerning myself, how do we functionalize that information? And I knew the answer was stem cells. But I waited for almost 10 years to look for technology. I'm always looking for technology. People know me that I see technology and I'll jump on it. And I looked for technology, and I happened to see this technology called induced pluripotent stem cells, which is the ability to take any cell from any person and modify that cell to be that of an embryonic-like stem cell. So in 2007, I saw this technology. I decided I was going to start a therapeutic company. I came here. I ended up starting a tools company because the venture capitalists here in 2008 drove me to form a company based on the tools business, but that became a very successful tools business. I think our sales now are up to 20 million in this private company. But my point is that technology is accessible. And that means that I can take any person in this room and I can create a stem cell for you. It takes about 13 weeks. It used to be very difficult, initial publications. We had a pipette, lab doing all kinds of work. But at the New York Stem Cell Foundation, we were able to automate the massive production of stem cells. We can currently do 192 per month. And over a 13-week period, we can do thousands per year. And so we can now make individuals and we have these robots that are doing this. And the idea is to array the genetics of man. And so that's become very, very interesting to me. So this technology is very early on. But the interesting about the technology is we can recapitulate many diseases in the dish now. That's a really, really important thing. So some of the more complex diseases has what I call simple genetics. And I'll use a very good example. Most of us are interested in this room. We have a relative that will have diabetes, a form that's called type 2. But type 2 diabetes is complex. It's all due to the fact that the beta cells cannot do certain things. Okay, we don't understand all those certain things, and when we have drugs against that biology. We actually showed in a recent publication that we can actually make beta cells from a genetic form of type 2, type 1, and we can actually correct that disease. So it says the model, the genetic model which we knew, we can correct the disease with a drug. Bingo. That means I can take type 2 patients, beta cells, put them on a dish, and start looking at that individual. So this kind of technology, recently we showed we can make cardiomyocytes from very genetic. And we know that various people in this room, about 5% of the people in this room will have a certain drug combination, an arrhythmia, due to how drugs interact with these ion channels. I can recapitulate in a dish. I can say, let's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, bingo, arrhythmia. That means that you, as a human being, I have a diagnostic that this combination of drugs will be bad for you. And so that's the problem. What we're seeing now with toxicity in man, we're seeing polypharma. The person's 80 years old, he's in a home, can't remember what drugs he's on. He's on 5, 6 different drugs, maybe 6 different drugs. He happens to take St. John's worts too, and all of a sudden, bingo, you have a side effect. You can see all this thing. You had individual cells from people. That was the goal of what we were doing. So this is kind of the work that we've been doing, and this is cutting edge technology. This is not even cutting edge, this is bleeding edge technology. This is taking stuff that nobody had thought about. And maybe we're probably 5 to 10 years. But I think the reality is coming very, very quickly because pharma started talking to us. We've done 4 deals in the last, pharma and other, foundation deals. Because recognize technology is very accessible. That's really important. And that means that I can make a stem cell line for every single person. And you'll have, not only you'll have your genetics, which is your genome sequence for under 1,000, you'll have your stem cells available. And that could be a whole open area of new medicine, diagnostics specifically. I'm really excited.
I headed up competitive analysis of the board and CFO at Bristol Myers Squibb for a number of years, but I don't have any industry experience that my colleague to my left has. He has had the privilege of not only working, in the pharma industry, but also working in the stem cell industry, and really has gotten to see products develop really from scratch to the marketplace. So, are there any things that the audience out there that you see should be aware of from how things have changed for pharma stem cells, the things that they should look for, the things that
emergency room, if it's an ischemic stroke and it's blocked, and you can get there within 3 hours, they can give you TPA and unblock the stroke, but only about 5% of the stroke patients will get to the hospital. For the most part, if you get to the hospital 24 to 48 hours later, whatever the recovery is, it is. And in fact, it's not good. A lot of patients will end up in nursing homes and convalescence facilities. Why have most stroke trials failed? If you think about most stroke trials, the goal is to get to the patient in the golden first couple of hours. Well, is that possible? The answer is no. It's just not possible. In the real world, patients are not going to get to the hospital within 2 to 3 hours of stroke. So what could we do? Well, it turns out that when you have a stroke, there's a lot of secondary damage that occurs in the 24 to 72 hour post period. Athersys did a really interesting study. They found that patients, when they were younger, who had a splenectomy, maybe from a car accident, they got hit in the chest with the steering wheel, and they lost their spleen, recovered dramatically better from strokes later in life than patients who had an intact spleen. And they started to theorize that there's an immunological component that occurs when ischemic injury strikes, and you have a deleterious cascade. Well, why couldn't you just treat those patients with small molecules that shut off that part of the immune system? You can, except that you potentially shut down some of the positive healing aspects of the immune system. So Athersys has theorized that if they administer 1.2 billion allogeneic, healthy, vital stem cells, those cells home. They home based on ischemic signals. They turn off inflammation and they upregulate the repair cycle. Athersys has just gone from $2 to $4 a share. It has about a $200 million market cap. They're going to report data in April from a trial that their partner Pfizer is running in Crohn's disease. I don't know if that trial is going to work or not. Nobody really knows, and Pfizer's controlling it. Even if it does work, what happens? Well, Pfizer will run to a phase 3 trial. That'll take 5 more years. What's interesting is Athersys has a 100% wholly owned stroke trial, and they'll report phase 2 data from that trial this summer. And if that data is good, and I think there's a lot of reasons and rationale when you look at the preclinical data to believe that the bias or the skew of the outcome is favorable, then it's going to represent a completely new paradigm in the way we treat stroke. So this is the typical biotech dilemma. What is Athersys worth if they have a viable new therapy for stroke? You know, if we were talking about Pharmasset, when their hepatitis B drug, Clevidine, failed, they had a $90 million market cap, $15 million in cash, and about 15 employees down in Princeton, New Jersey. I went to their board meeting. It was a public open board meeting, and I was the only person that came. No one was interested. Interesting, because we know that Gilead acquired Pharmasset for $125 a share and $11.25 billion market cap. So we do see paradigm shifts. I would tell you that Athersys is still pretty cheap. Just raised cash. They have about 50 million on the balance sheet. They have 2 great data points coming. I'm a little bit more nervous about the ulcerative colitis trial, but I'm very excited for the stroke trial. Why? Because the window to treat these patients is 24 to 72 hours, and I really believe that if you can see a signal, a 15% or a 20% difference in the recovery of these patients when measured by typical metrics that are used in stroke trials, like the Rankin scale, out at 3 months and out at 6 months, then this stock could be a home run, and it could represent a completely new treatment paradigm. And that's the promise of stem cells. And it didn't have to be Athersys. We could have been talking about stem cell zinc, which for 10 years has been incredibly scrutinized by the FDA. Do these pluripotent cells cause cancer? The FDA has finally relinquished and said they're safe. So now what is the company doing? They're expanding to multiple centers, and they're going to look at spinal cord paralysis, and they're going to look at dry macular degeneration. What put Regeneron on the map? When I covered the stock in 2010, it was $14 a share. So Regeneron closed about 225.
225.
Yeah. So you know, wet macular degeneration is what put Regeneron on the marketplace and on the map. Dry macular degeneration is 10 times larger than wet. You mentioned ACTC, which I always thought meant all cash towards genomics. It's also the ticker symbol for advanced cell technologies. And ACTC and STEM, ticker symbol STEM, are both working in dry macular degeneration to reformulate the back of the eye. It's called the RPE layer. I met a cowboy down in Texas who's blind, 400 vision. He now is riding his horses again. His vision has been restored to 40/40. Now it's just an N of 1, but when you start to see data like that coming from these companies, it tells you that data is coming and that things are changing. So I think that's the promise of stem cell therapy, is when we talk about completely unmet medical needs like macular degeneration. What happens if you take someone that's a quadriplegic and you restore sensation and give them control of their bladder? What's that worth? I can tell you it's worth a lot. So, you know, we're in a very new era of medicine, and, you know, it's really important to pay attention now to the clinical trials and then to not be trapped by the fact that, yes, the industry came public 10 years too early.
Another stem cell company that I encourage people to look at is ISCO, headed up by Simon Kraws, that we wrote. There's a full research report available at crucialaria.com, so look at that for some more of the details. On these comments, in addition to these companies, which I also especially emphasis, Steve, you've been on the funding side, and you've watched it grow, and now, you know, 2 questions for you. One, the United States obviously fell way behind in the stem cell arena because a lot of the scientists rushed overseas to rush to places where they could do that. 1, are we catching up in that arena now? And 2, given the speed that we've now been able to do things at, which you alluded to earlier, what sort of things do you see as being possible that investors might see actually taking place in the marketplace, say over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, the Japanese are at one time, and Jason ran a franchise for a company that both of us were at, that it took them forever, the Japanese regulatory process. But recently and I think this is a telling point about how the Japanese regulatory, they recognized that they were too slow. And they have done a paradigm shift in the biologics, specifically in the area of cell therapy. That's really, to me, it was like, wow, that is just unbelievable. It was mandated by really the discovery of this ability to make these induced pluripotent stem cells by this guy, Shinya Yamanaka. And he, as a leading light, said, well, not only this is great technology, but it's useless if I just use it in my laboratory. He aggressively pushed it forward into the clinical scenario. So the Japanese government did a think tank, as like they do in census building, and I've watched it over the last 4 years. I've been visited Japan several times when I was in my private company, and see that this evolution where they essentially laid it down, which is now the paradigm of how the regulatory process will work in Japan. For, in this one case, macular degeneration. They're interested in other diseases, so they have a systematic way of how they're approaching it. And that's going to be probably a model, a blueprint for the U.S. I also had, this fall, I was in England twice for 2 very important meetings. But the most important, telling anybody these important meetings were the regulatory process in Europe. Now that's confused. They're trying to figure out how to do so for example, they are very concerned about everything has to go to GMP. And many times in our work, and especially in biotech, we're just exploring, it's discovery. But we make that discovery and then we implement procedures. The European rules were such, and hopefully we will, there's harmonization meetings are going to occur. Europeans, we have to start right at the beginning, right at the top, the highest levels to do things. That adds a tremendous cost in doing things. And that's just where the field is working. And a lot of it is, I call it, in stem cells, there are a lot of academics. And these academics are thought leaders, and they have opinions. those opinions, unfortunately, impinge the field sometimes because the practicality of what drug development is not an academic field. You don't see there's the Department of Drug Development at Harvard. There's the Department of Genetics, Department of Stem Cell Biology. Most of those professors are professors. They have no clue what drug discovery is. For those of us who train in pharma and in biotech, we understand what drug discovery is. It is a discipline and an art, but it's also fundamentally regulated in a way. Most researchers aren't regulated. They just kind of come in and say, it's a good day, they'll do an experiment, it's going to do results, boom, which is half my group in the foundation. They kind of come in randomly saying, hey, it's a good day, it's Sunday, I can do an experiment, and this experiment's going to, but they don't think about what the ramifications of the experiments are. That's how most academic research is doing. Drug discovery is very, very targeted. In the stem cell space, we have to add a lot of discipline, but that discipline is overlaid by this, I call this conflict of the academic world. And that causes what I'd say in this case, like I think 10 years too early. In California, we have this wonderful initiative called CERM, which is the Regenerative Medicine, which was a $3 billion bond for stem cells. That's had a tremendous economic impact on research. The question comes out, what's the impact on cures and therapies? And it looks like the company Biosite, the private company, is really, really doing a great job. They're essentially making pancreatic-like cells. They replace the islet cells. They can put that in a privately held company. That's a company in the next 6 months to a year I look to be going public because they actually have a viable step. They're going to go into type 1 patients with no measurable insulin. They have a great study. They work with the FDA, and then they're going to put it in, and it's really simple. Do they have insulin or do they not? And it's a really, really simple trial. That's a clinical relevant trial. Now, it's an experiment. Can't do it in a mouse, can't do it in a primate, got to do it in a human. I'm pretty excited by that result of that company.
Now, Japan has obviously been a technological leader or a technological perfecter of technology invented other places in the world. And Japan has been hugely trying to get involved with biotech and pharma for the past 30 plus years. Given we have somebody with experience there, could you elucidate upon Stephen's comments?
Sure, no, I really would. When I first joined Shearing Plow in Japan, I want to tell you a really quick story. All of the monitors in the office, there were like 100 people on the floor sitting next to each other, and every monitor was monochrome green. I looked at the monitor really carefully, and I was like, this is a colored monitor. This can display more than a green color. And I went to Akihabara, which was the technology center in Japan, and I bought a copy as a Windows, and I installed it in the computer, and bang, all of a sudden we had color. And everyone crowded around me, and they said, what are you doing? And I talked about using Excel, and using Lotus. We got into the Windows environment. Within 3 months, the entire office had converted to that platform. I mean, the rapidity at which that platform and that conversion occurred was just mind-boggling. So while Japan has resisted change for a long time, recently dramatic change occurred. Japan opened up an expedited, fast-track pathway for cell therapy companies based on 2 realizations. One, we're not talking about pluripotent cells when we talk about either autologous, your own cells, or allogeneic, someone else's stem cells, but a committed cell, a mesenchymal cell. It's not going to become something else. It's a repair cell. That's how we should think of it. Japan said, there's lots of data out there that says that these are absolutely safe. They've been evaluated in thousands and thousands of patients around the world. So we're not that concerned about safety. If you can run a small phase 2 trial, maybe even bridging off of your US study, and you can demonstrate reasonable efficacy in patients, we'll prove it. Well, what does that mean for Athersis? Athersis is now in a phase 2 trial in the United States and Europe. Do you think that it's likely that Athersis is going to open up a few hospitals in Japan and treat stroke in Japan? By the way, the highest incidence and prevalence of stroke in the world is in Japan. So you can bet that regenerative medical companies are looking at Japan, half the population of the United States, the largest consumer in the world in terms of volume of pills, and saying, let's take advantage of these regulations. And in fact, We can mirror that a little bit to what's occurring here. There's something called breakthrough designation, a completely new pathway that's just opened up, and we're beginning to see it being used. So when I talk about the fact that it's taken forever to get here, it certainly feels that way. But I think the speed at which we're going to see the translation from phase 2 to phase 3 to commercialization is going to be really, really impressive. And we may see it faster than expected, because if companies like Mesoblast, companies like Athersys go through a rapid pathway in Japan, we could see dramatic commercialization. So I think it's a very, very exciting time in the industry, and I think it's really going to be worth paying attention to.
Now, Steve, a lot of the attention, as we're ready to go for this year, wearing very colorful pink socks today, and that's pink socks, purple pink, breast cancer awareness, and obviously breast cancer gets a tremendous play from the NFL, across the board, women's organizations, but the reality is the number one killer of women's cardiovascular disease. What do you see as far as where you think the first products that come on the market? I mean, you and I were both around, I was covering Cytogen when I got the first monoclonal antibodies approved, early 90s. So what do you think the first application is going to be that actually has a chance to make it on the marketplace? And what do you think about the disease categories as to which ones you see in the aggregate that most of the companies are going on?
Well, without a doubt, to me, is the ocular area. While the repair of the RPE, we know that clinically, you can take somebody who's got macular degeneration. Essentially the macula is the center where the light focuses. The rest of the RPE, or the retina, on the outside, is just there for. It's there biologically. You can actually take a cut. Since you don't use that for light focusing, you can take a cut. You can cut a piece of that and patch it with your own cells, and that works. It's a difficult surgery, but it's doable. They do it in Europe at the Moorfields, which is the greatest eye hospital in the world. So Moorfields said, the investigator said, hey, if I could do this, can I use another cell type from the thing? In that case, this is Pete Coffey, one of our investigators that we gave a prize to. He said, can I take embryonic stem cells and convert those into RPE? No problem. So he has a trial with Pfizer. But Pete also commutes. Pete said, hey, California hired him in Santa Barbara. So he's half the time in Santa Barbara. He said, he's scratching his head in Santa Barbara, what am I going to do? So Pete and I have been discussing, he's working on using induced pluripotent stem cells, which is the cells from the person converted into stem cells. So that's the next set of products. But I said to Pete recently, I said, but macular degeneration is just not about RPE. There's something called Brooks membrane, which is how the cells actually sit. So the disease itself is more complex. People don't realize that. There's probably another form, which is the Brooks membrane. Is there ability to take form Brooks membrane and RPE from that? So you're seeing systematic improvements. What I'm saying is you're seeing systematic improvements in the technology over the next 5 to 10 years. We'll know very, very quickly if this works. We already have inklings that it works. Now we're just going to look for these, like Jason says, controlled clinical trials. Cardiovascular. I unfortunately was at Sharing when we did one of the largest cardiovascular studies, 22,000 patients for Integral. Huge trial, marginally successful, marginally useful. The problem with cardiovascular, for reasons that are unknown, is there's a high placebo effect. And so consequently, the trials must be powered in very, very large number of patients. So while a lot of phase 2 studies have shown positive results, patches, things like that, when you go on to subsequent trials, they fail because of, I think, this placebo effect. So in cardiovascular, I don't know that's the right way to go at this point. I mean, we know that in ischemic disease where the tissue's destroyed, we need to get cells there. There are people in my group actually working on tissue patches trying to do tissue patches, trying to put it in there like a molecular Band-Aid to see if the cells, if you get the right conditions and the right cells, will the cells help the heart. Some of the older studies where people just injected cells and hoped, that it would work. It's a much more difficult thing, and I think they ran into, statistical problems.
You're hitting the nail on the head, which is it's an ischemic disease, so scientists believe what cells do to someone who's got a heart attack or congestive heart failure, they revascularize. So theoretically it should work.
Right.
The science makes sense, but proving it clinically in well-controlled trials is tough. And of course, we've been misled many, many times, right? Sometimes a really good phase 2 trial isn't reproduced in phase 3. Why? So, but I will say, techniques are getting more sophisticated, statistical analysis is getting better, and then we're getting better understanding of how to do that. The integralin ReoPro days is kind of a resurrection of thinking 20 years ago, but I think that it's changed. The clinical science has gotten better.
Became reasonably famous when a certain stock was leaked on a Sunday evening in the Wall Street and New York Times, and the stock opened the next day at $100 and some odd about 15, 20 years ago. And I got to go on CNBC with Maria Bartolome, and she said, well, what do you think about this phenomenon? Obviously, any company did it, went backwards. And I got asked the question under tremendous pressure when the stock took off. Is he smiling or remembers it? And the guy looked at me, she looked at me, and I just looked at her, and immediately he came to me and I said, it's a long way between mice and men. And indeed it is, as he has proven with being able to cure mice of cancer but having no way for the mice to pay. With that, I thank you very much, and I now open the floor for questions.
So, where do you see commercially the next wave of therapy or whatever of the stem cell? What particular part of the human condition, if you like, do you think it's likely to be successful in addressing?
Well, actually, there's a company that I know a lot about called Fate Therapeutics, and this is a very good bone marrow transplant. What most people don't realize that there is, in bone marrow transplant, there is this idea based on just long history of using adult marrow transplant, be it allogeneic or autologous, that it's based on a number of cells. But there is this kind of window called cord blood stem cells. Cord blood stem cells actually result in a lot greater impact. But the problem with a lot of transplants is you need more cells. And there was this one group based on some funky experiments done at Harvard showed that you had a compound, prostaglandin compound, essentially an aspirin-like analog per se, and they could expand massively these cells, and they could put it in transplant. So this should be very, very, to me, very important. The idea that you can expand the transplants and make sure the transplants work, because that's really, really critical. Because you don't, transplants in the hospital, time to being in the hospital is a very costly experiment. And so if you can get more, the cost, it's directly related. The more cells you give into a person, the quicker he gets out of the hospital.
What kind of transplants are you talking about?
These are bone marrow transplants.
So give us an example where you think it would work.
Certainly in certain types of cancer where they come in and they blink you because you have both cancer and leukemia, and they retransplant you. And the time in the hospital, remember, you're in an intensive care unit, and the economics of healthcare is those are $5,000, $6,000, $10,000 a day stays.
In particular, in the 70s when mine was done, because of the fact that we continued to large load, because they wanted to just keep it bubble because your immune system is completely obliterated. That would have been.
So the whole idea is there's because you need this thing called platelets. Platelets are your first line of defense, really, for wound healing, infections, and things like that. They're really, really critical. And so they look for the appearance of platelets, and they keep you in the hospital a long time. If you can get the platelets up very, really quickly, then you actually can send the person home to the from the hospital or to a lesser isolation. That's really, really critical. So that right there is an add-on to an existing technology, which is quite successful. Jeff is a perfect example of that. That you can add on to it, it improves the cost in care. It should actually be very, should have a high economic value. Again, I don't know how they're going to do it. The formulas for how to calculate those things is pretty difficult.
No, I would just say let's watch and see what the stroke data looks like this summer for mattresses. If that data is good, I believe that you're going to see that therapy commercialized very quickly in Japan with stunning implications for the entire industry. Well, near term, we're expecting today, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, we're expecting an announcement from Teva. Are they moving forward with the 1,700-person global phase 3 clinical trial with Revascor, the cell therapy that they've licensed from Mesoblast? Mesoblast has been telling us that that trial is imminent. They've been saying that for a year. However, what happened at Teva, there have been management turnover. And if you're a new CEO, are you going to commit to a $130 million cell therapy trial if you are essentially thought of as a generic pharmaceutical company? If we see that bet, I think that that's a very significant bet by Big Pharma, in this case Teva, that they believe in Revascor. And so we look for that and see what happens.
You had a question?
Yeah, you brought up pancreatic beta cell transplantation, pancreatic islet cell transplantation, what we currently do. That's what I do. And we lose a tremendous amount of money each time we do one of those. And even in Ivy League departments, we're becoming more and more an eat what you kill environment. Even tenured professors and department chairs are pushing us for productivity data regarding what's our reimbursement. Can we justify our existence? And putting stem cell and pancreatic islet cells, closely stem cells, into the context of the ACA, where we're struggling right now to get reimbursed and losing money on each of the pancreatic islet cells transplants that I do. How is this restriction of reimbursement that we are already seeing with the ACA going to affect the elaboration of stem cell therapies?
I mean, I think Jason can actually talk about something that it happened this summer to two wound care companies, cutting edge technology, Shire and Organogenesis, right? And Shire Organogenesis, where these two companies were from the original. I was actually a scientific advisor for a company called Advanced Tissue Synthesis, which had 3 products, of which they were eventually went bankrupt. The company then got sold, it became Advanced Biohealing, and then Shire bought them for their product. And Organogenesis went bankrupt. Again, they also came from the ashes, and they but there a reimbursement issue became. They lumped everything together, this cutting edge wound healing product with things that were just your simple band-aids and things like that, as a CMS coded product, where all of a sudden people like, again, the bean counters say, oh my God, it's this category. Why should I pay? I'm only going to be reimbursed for this much. And that's really there an issue of patients not advocating early enough, the companies being misled by government, pressures of how CMS reimbursed. That tells you a high-value biotech product that was very, very efficacious is all of a sudden essentially been hammered. These companies are just, Organogenesis is as a company, they're going to struggle because their sales are going to go down dramatically.
Which seems even more, exacerbated further when we talk about stem cells, because even islet cell transplantation.
But see,
I would twist this a little bit different. Yeah, I would twist this a little bit different. I would say to you that islet cell transplantation is pretty controversial still. There is, if you can successfully reconstitute pancreatic function via islet transplantation cells, and you can do it on a consistent basis, then the next question is, how do you scale that for the masses? What's the value proposition, particularly in juvenile onset diabetes, if you can rebuild pancreatic function? It's a phenomenal cost savings. So the reality is that while it might be an expensive procedure, the alternatives to congestive heart failure, massive heart attack, and going through 5 years of a miserable quality of life, ultimately in death, versus arresting that trend, you know, there's an economic value proposition there. It's just you've got to demonstrate that. You've got to demonstrate it at commercial scale, and we're not there yet in terms of beta cell transplantation. What's really interesting too is that there's lots of other stuff going on, right? I think of diabetes as systemic disease. I think about it as systemic inflammation. And in fact, if you could remove the systemic inflammation, maybe you can regenerate beta cells without a transplant. But we haven't quite conquered all of those metrics yet. So it's very expensive, very experimental, and yes, you need industry advocation in order to support that kind of research. But we're not at a commercial
But
cost.
there also, probably, you know that there are strong patient advocate groups. I started my science in this era of trying to make an HIV vaccine. We knew the technology, and while we failed in the HIV, I sat on 2 different NIH study sections, and the greatest thing that happened was the patient advocates. Because I do not believe, I sat in those study sections, the smartest men in the room at the time would say, no, we would work on these reverse transcriptase inhibitors because we just get these better ones and this and this. And they were all focused. These are academics, smart, really smart guys who knew their enzymology, were ignorant of the life cycle of the virus. But the patient advocates really just kept pushing. HIV is a controlled disease now. It's not cured, but it's controlled. I mean, I lost 2 colleagues to that disease. They would be alive today if we had these drugs. And these drugs was pushed by the advocates. I mean, I remember in 1988, most farmers it's AIDS. That's a gay disease. We're not going to work on that. That's too controversial. They're worried about it. But the advocates push, and that made the difference. I believe that's where the role. Well, our foundation is actually a patient advocate foundation for stem cells. That we do most of it. We advocate for certain things. Believe that certain things have to be pushed, and otherwise government will do this. This Obamacare thing is like God knows what's happening.
Well, this is the point: is that when you centralize, then you relieve the individual support groups from any responsibility. When it's all going to be ACA funded, right? It's all going to be government funded. Then any individual advocacy group loses its efficacy.
Well, I think you're going to have a tremendous amount of patients, just in closing here. The people with the money want to live longer, and that's a very important thing to remember, because there's greater knowledge available, there's greater information available, the science is better than it's ever been, the computers and the software is better than it's ever been. It's enabling the scientists to do more. The people with the money want to live longer. And as one of the most famous golfers to ever play the game, B. Mello, said, it's an easy game, little ball, little hole. I think the science finally is going to take advantage of the fact that they have the tools that they need, and the patient population is much smarter than they've ever been, and they will move towards conquering disease. And it is the belief of your panelists up here that we're going to see more progress made in medicine in the next 5 to 15 years than we've seen in the past few decades. I thank you, and we'll be available for questions.
The bar, I believe, is opening.
Bar opening.
Time now, so if you drop on down for a drink.